The advanced trigger library in the 6000 series is selectable from the icon in the trigger menu, and this is a selection of trigger conditions which let the user specify particular trigger conditions either in terms of time or in terms of amplitude. So the first trigger condition is the simple edge trigger. It can specify a rising or a falling edge to trigger on. Here we trigger on the falling edge, but the second library, for example the advanced trigger, we can specify a rising or falling edge with a hysteresis set. So here we can see it's triggering on a rising or a falling edge within a hysteresis band. The remaining libraries allow the user to specify special time events or amplitude events to trigger on a particular condition. So for example, the window condition has 2 threshold levels, and we're looking at the 2 thresholds then, so we trigger when an edge crosses into or out of a specified window. As an example of a dual threshold, we're going to select now the runt trigger. So here we're looking for a condition where, again with 2 thresholds, where a signal passes through one threshold but doesn't pass through a second threshold before it re-enters the original threshold. So for example, we could set a higher threshold of 500 millivolts and a lower threshold here of 100 millivolts. So we're looking for a signal that passes through 100 millivolts but doesn't pass through 400 millivolts before it passes back through 100. So here we see a condition that satisfies this. It passes through the lower level but doesn't pass through the higher level before it occurs. So this is a signal embedded in a sequence of pulses. It only happens very occasionally, but at the one time it happens, the trigger circuit will pick out that particular condition. Obviously we can stop the acquisition then if we want to do some analysis on it. So one thing we could do here is provide another trigger condition. We could actually trigger on the width of this missing pulse. So we'll measure the time. So I'll put a cursor on here and a second cursor. So this is a very wide pulse, so if we're going to look for a pulse which is say greater than 3 microseconds to trigger on, and it will be a low going pulse of a trigger level of say 400 millivolts. So that trigger library would be the pulse width. So we're triggering on a negative pulse, say with 400 millivolts trigger level and for a time of 3 microseconds. So we can close the... So here we're again triggering, and we're capturing the wide pulse width. So here again we see it changing when that random event occurs occasionally. Other trigger conditions provided in the library, an interval trigger. So if we've got a repeating pulse, a clock, and then it doesn't occur for a certain time, then we can trigger on that condition. Similarly again with a pulse width trigger, trigger when a signal exits a window and stays outside for more than a specified time. So we specify a window time and then it will provide the trigger. The level dropout, again we've got a clock running and it stays high for a certain time and then it will provide a trigger. Similar one with a window trigger, so we can provide a threshold window and then it specifies a time that the signal stays outside of that. So these are advanced libraries which can be used to search for a particular unique feature of any particular data pattern.